Okay. On the other hand, the self-same radio performance or live TV performance has the capacity to be transmitted to many disparate reception sites, while films and photos are objects that can be reproduced, multiply, and transported to many different places, affording thereby the possibility that effectively exact tokens of the film type or photo type in question can be consumed simultaneously. Ontologically, the mass artwork is a type whose numerically distinct tokens are identical in the sense that two dimes of the same painting are identical. Moreover, a mass artwork such as a film differs from a play, which in certain respects is also a type, insofar as different tokens of a play, that is to say, different productions, are not identical insofar as they will enlist non-identical casts, sets, and so on. And this, of course, is why plays are not automatically cases of mass art, for identical productions of them, if they are not filmed or taped, cannot be delivered or to two or more disparate reception sites simultaneously. Previously, I claimed that Novitz's argument that mass art has no intrinsic distinguishing features overlooked certain alternative options for characterizing its distinctive features. The notion that mass art is art produced and distributed by a mass delivery system is such an alternative. Call it a necessary structural feature of mass art. Moreover, this feature commands our attention once we try to differentiate the kind of art people are attempting to characterize in debates about contemporary art. For the connection with mass delivery systems is what differentiates the relevant popular art of our times from popular art construed ahistorically. However, though production and distribution via a mass technology partially differentiates mass art from other sorts of art, it does not tell the whole story, for mass art is designed to elicit mass consumption, and though being produced by a mass medium makes this possible, in one sense it is not, in and of itself, enough to discharge the function of engaging mass audiences. For avant-garde art can be produced and distributed via a mass medium, but avant-garde art is typically designed to frustrate or problematize mass consumption. Thus, identifying mass art with art produced in a mass medium does not yield a full account of mass art proper, for a full account of the nature of the mass art proper is a matter of saying in virtue of what features mass art fulfills the function of engaging mass audiences. So, a full account of the nature of mass art must provide some indication of how art produced in a mass medium is designed to command the attention of mass audiences. And it is the third condition in my theory that is supposed to supply an indication of the design considerations that ideally enable mass art to fulfill its function. Mass art is differentiated from the more amorphous category of popular art in terms of mass delivery technologies. Furthermore, mass art is differentiated from other forms of art that exploit mass delivery systems in virtue of the functional tendency of mass art to gravitate toward choices of devices, structures, affects, and even contents which promise easy accessibility with minimum effort for the largest number of intuited audiences. Earlier, I suggested that my account of mass art might supply a hypothesis for empirical research. What I had in mind is that if one accepts my account of mass art, then one way in which to isolate and analyze central elements of mass art will be to explore the ways in which those elements facilitate accessibility by large, untutored audiences expending minimum effort. For example, one might analyze the ways in which certain devices of mass movie narration and TV narration, such as point of view editing, are key to innate dispositions of primate perception. For obviously, where the devices of mass art mobilize innate responses, their reception by mass audiences are virtually guaranteed. Of course, I do not mean to suggest that all of the central structures of mass art are connected to hardwired features of the human organism. Some may be, and in those cases, it is theoretically valuable to take note of them. In other cases, the accessibility of the central devices of the various mass arts may require amplification in terms of historical and cultural considerations. For example, the convention of the fade out and its virtually immediate recognition by audiences would not be explained in terms of innate perceptual dispositions of the human organism, but in terms of the way in which this convention expanded upon techniques, such as dimming the lightning and dropping the curtain, that were already known to audiences familiar with these theatrical markers for scene endings. That is, the intelligibility and accessibility of the fade out would be explained in virtue of an historical transposition of pre existing practices, rather than in terms of exclusively hardwired perceptual capacities. Nevertheless, whether the explanations depend on biological, psychological, social, or historical factors, or upon a mix thereof, an unavoidable avenue of empirical research into the phenomenon of mass art is the isolation and characterization of the structures that secure its accessibility. Moreover, as I suggest parenthetically in condition 3, mass art may not only gravitate towards certain formal features for the sake of their accessibility. Mass arts may also gravitate toward the exploration of certain generic affects, such as teenage love as enshrined in endless popular songs because they are commonly recognized by mass audiences. Indeed, even the narrative content of mass art may be chosen because of its accessibility. Action-adventure stories are undoubtedly particularly serviceable for the purposes of mass art because action stories, with their premium on problems and solutions, often practical solutions achieved by physical means, are more immediately intelligible to broadly undifferentiated general audiences than are stories that require complex social or technical know-how. That is, it is easier for the average moviegoer to comprehend how a kickboxer fights his way out of an ambush than it is to comprehend the intricate and crafty financial maneuvering of leveraged corporate takeovers, or the behavior of people with infinitely subtle sexual preferences. In my criticisms of Novitz's elimination theory, I questioned whether his denial of the relevance of formal and effective properties for the purpose of identifying mass art was too hasty. Now perhaps the basis for my suspicion is evident. The third condition in my theory implies that formal and effective factors do have a role to play in identifying mass art. Mass art is, in part, a functional concept. The intended function of mass art is to elicit mass engagement. Thus, mass art will gravitate to formal and effective choices that facilitate the function of mass art. We may not be able to draw up a list of the formal features of mass art. However, this does not mean that formal features are irrelevant to identifying mass art. For given an artwork produced and distributed by a mass delivery system, we will count it as an instance of mass art only in its formal features, whatever they might be, are conducive to mass accessibility. Proleptically, let me point out that in my view, mass art is such that it is designed to promote mass accessibility. This concedes that something may be an instance of mass art even if it fails to promote mass accessibility. A production may be a work of mass art, even if it is a bungled attempt, that is, as a result of ineptitude, something that is inaccessible. But on my view, as long as it can be established that the work in question was intentionally designed to be generally accessible, even if it is not, it still counts as a work of mass art. Ok, donc c'est l'intention qui compte. Also, I claim that works of mass art gravitate toward formal choices that enhance accessibility. This language allows that accessibility is a degree concept, and that establishing whether a given formal choice is to be assessed as accessible or inaccessible will depend upon judgment calls based upon reflecting on comparisons and contrasts between a candidate strategy and alternative strategies of construction that are available within the same historical context. Throughout my discussion of the formal functional differentiae that demarcate mass art, I have repeatedly used avant-garde art, specifically avant-garde art produced via mass media, as the pertinent logical contrast to mass art proper. By mobilizing this contrast, that is to say, by asking what is the difference between art produced in mass media, such as avant-garde art, and mass art proper, I put myself argumentatively in the position to hypothesize the third condition of my theory of mass art. However, it pays to note that avant-garde art is not only a conceptual foil to mass art proper. It is also, I believe, the relevant historical form of art which contrasts with mass art. Throughout the various debates that have been staged about mass art in this century, critics of mass art have consistently disparaged mass art because of its failure to measure up to the standards of avant-garde art. Critics of mass art like MacDonald, Greenberg, Collingwood, Ortega Y. Gasset, Adorno, and Horkheimer have all been proponents of avant-garde art, and the features of mass art that lead them to consign it to the realm of pseudo-art are really features that derive from the brutal fact that mass art is not avant-garde art, where the notion of avant-garde art itself is generally bound up with some misunderstanding of Kantian aesthetics. Moreover, since avant-garde art has the best claim to being the high art of our epoch, it is easy to see why many commentators misdescribe the contrast between avant-garde art and mass art in terms of a distinction between high art and popular art. Mass art and avant-garde art in our times, I hypothesize, have developed in contrast to each other, and historically, the most important boundaries in the contemporary conception of the arts have to do with the way in which they carve up much of the genus of art into two highly visible, contrary species. This is not to say that there are not other sorts of art existing at present, including perhaps what is called middlebrow art and even some authentic folk art. Nonetheless, the highly structured distinction between mass art and avant-garde art marks the most significant theoretical boundary between the arts in contemporary Western culture. This discussion of the contrast between mass art and avant-garde art will undoubtedly remind the reader that the first condition in my theory requires that the mass artwork be art. I have not argued for this condition, supposing that it is obvious that a mass artwork must be an artwork. What else would it be? A product of commercial views. But this answer, I predict, may displease many, for the case seems rigged. Couldn't I have initially oriented my project in terms of attempting to identify something called mass cultural productions? And suddenly mass cultural productions, like network news shows, are not obviously all artworks. This is true. But the realm of mass cultural productions represents a larger class of things than I am at present prepared to theorize. I expect that much of what I say about mass artworks will pertain to mass cultural productions in general, but for the present, my target is narrower. I am concerned to identify only those mass cultural projections that are connected to recognizable art forms, such as painting, sculpture, music, drama, dance, literature, and to a certain extent, architecture. I see no problem in principle in attempting to characterize this subset of mass cultural production, even if some of my findings may apply to other sorts of mass cultural productions, that is, to mass cultural productions other than mass artworks. Of course, the remaining problem that many may find with my theory is that I have not provided the reader with any way in which to identify art. Nevertheless, we do have theories about the way in which to identify art. Indeed, I myself have developed such a view. So at this point in the dialectic, I shall refer you to those theories, should you wish to know how to determine whether a candidate for membership in the class of mass artworks is an instance of art. And if you remain unhappy with all of the available theories and/or approaches for identifying art, let me conjecture that whatever theory of identifying art that wins out in the long run will be serviceable for the purposes of applying my theory of mass art. Fiski's rejection of the concept of mass art. I have already noted that many practitioners of what is called cultural studies, like Brundtlinger and Ross, find the notion of mass art distasteful. But if it is simply a matter of distastefulness, then I think that my comments about the numerical sense of mass art should allay their worries. However, there is one theorist of cultural studies who appears to believe that the notion of mass art is not only distasteful, it is metaphysically impossible. And of course, if such a view is convincing, then my theory of mass art must be wrong. For one should be willing to abandon any theory of something that doesn't exist. In his Understanding Popular Culture, John Fiske writes, "What popular culture is not, however, is mass culture. Mass culture is a term used by those who believe that the cultural commodities produced and distributed by the industries can be imposed upon the people in a way that irons out social differences and produces a unified culture for a passive, alienated mass audience. Such a process, if it existed and it does not, would be anti-cultural and anti-popular. It would be antithesis of culture understood as the production and circulation of meanings and pleasures, and of the popular as an intransigent, oppositional, scandalous set of forces. There is no mass culture." Fiske comes to this conclusion about mass culture and presumably about mass art because he has a very special theory of popular culture. Ordinarily, we think that popular culture is comprised of objects, like books and toys, and mass-produced events, like TV miniseries. That is, ordinarily, we think of popular culture and popular art from the production, distribution side of things. And this leads up to think of popular art as a collection of certain types of products, namely those designed for popular consumption. But Fiske thinks of popular culture differently. not from the producer's side of things, but from the audience's side. Popular culture is something that the people, so-called, do, and not something that the culture industry produces. Indeed, popular culture is something that people do with the commodities that the so-called culture industry produces. Popular culture comprises the ways in which the people use these products for their own purposes, which uses are at variance with the uses intended by the dominant ideology and are, therefore, at least in this sense, oppositional and even generally progressive politically, though not radical politically. For Fiske, popular culture is, by definition, a site of resistance. Aborigines, for example, may use Westerns for their own purposes. They cheer at the slaughter of white settlers as their wagon trains are surrounded by Indians. This, of course, is at variance with the intentions of the producers of the Westerns in question, who undoubtedly anticipated that audiences would be horrified by the massacre of the white settlers. But the Aborigine audience has, so to speak, recoded such scenes as occasions for celebrating setbacks to white imperialism. Fiske calls this type of cultural resistance to the intended point of such Westerns producially, undoubtedly alluding to, while freely adapting, Roland Barthes' distinction between the readerly and the writerly. That is, the Aborigines use the relevant commodity in a way in which it was not intended to be used. They produce an alternative meaning for the scene that is important for the Aborigine community and its interests. People not only resist the commodities of the culture industry by producing alternative significance for said commodities, they may also purportedly use the commodities of the culture industry to evade the disciplinary regimes for the dominant ideology. Fiske cites wrestling programs as an example of the evasion of the dictates of the dominant ideology, for the audience of wrestling programs supposedly celebrates grotesque body types that are putatively in violation of the norms of the dominant ideology. That is to say, Andre the Giant is no one's idea of the ideal model for Armani tailoring. Likewise, adolescents who loiter in shopping malls, buying nothing, evade, subvert, and putatively resist the imperatives of consumer society by eschewing its norms of conduct. Whether or not these examples are persuasive, they nevertheless give us a sense of how John Fiske conceives of popular culture. Popular culture is a particular kind of use that a certain group, called the people, as in the people united will never be defeated, make of industrially produced commodities and their venues of distribution. The relevant kind of use in this regard is resistant or oppositional. That is, popular culture is the use of commodities by the people in ways, either producily or evasive, that vary from those intended by the culture industry's technocrats, in which alternative uses, in turn, serve the purposes of the people. Stated schematically, Fiske's theory of popular culture is X is an instance of popular culture if and only if 1. X is a use of commodity by and for the people that is either 2. Producily or 3. Evasive, and which is 4. Relevant to the everyday lives and struggles of the people. Speaking diagnostically, it is evident how Fiske came to this view. Reacting to the Althusserian approach to cultural studies, which seemed to entail that resistance to the operation of the ideology communicated by the products of the popular culture industry was impossible, Fiske set out in the exactly opposite theoretical direction. If Althusserians appeared to provide no theoretical accommodation for the fact that people were not always invariably positioned by pop culture, conceived of as what Althusserians called an ideological state apparatus, Fiske responds by reconstruing popular culture as nothing but a site of resistance to the dominant ideology. Surely, as I myself have argued, the Althusserian viewpoint is flawed insofar as it entails that people are incapable of rejecting the ideology communicated through popular culture. But this flaw is an empirical flaw. It doesn't square with the facts. Yet it is not clear that moving, as Fiske does, to a position that is the polar opposite of Althusserianism has much to recommend it, empirically either. Surely the empirical point to make against an Althusserian approach to popular culture is that sometimes people resist the ideological address implicit in popular art. But Fiske opposes Althusserianism by maintaining that people are almost always resisting the ideological address of the products of the culture industry, and this seems no more likely empirically than the view that they are never resisting the ideological address of the producers of the culture industry. Of course, when one looks closely at Fiske's theory of popular culture, it becomes apparent almost immediately that Fiske's theory is not an empirical theory. Popular culture is always a site of resistance, of either the producerly or the evasive variety as a matter of definition, rather than as a matter of fact. Furthermore, popular culture and popular art cannot be reconceived as mass culture or mass art in the ways I propose, because of the manner in which Fiske defines the popular. For the popular, according to Fiske, is a matter of the resistant usages to which commodities are adapted, whereas mass art, in my sense, refers to products structured in a certain way. Moreover, since my conception of mass art presupposes that the products of mass art are often successfully designed to elicit convergent responses from large numbers, even massive numbers of people, there is no place for my version of mass art in the universe as stipulated by Fiske's definition, since in that universe, when it comes to popular culture, all is different uses and meanings that the people find to answer to their own purposes and needs in their situated struggles with the hegemonic ideology. But if the issue is really a matter of definition, let us ask whether Fiske's definition is a good one. I cannot see that it is. Whether or not you agree with my contention that popular art is better conceived in terms of mass art, and for that matter, that popular culture is nowadays better understood as mass culture, we nevertheless probably pretty much agree upon what falls into the categories of popular culture and popular art. Will Fiske's definition of popular culture coincide with our pre-theoretical intuitions about the extension of the concept of popular culture? I doubt it. Presumably, we all agree that Anton von Webern's tonal music is not an example of popular culture. Any theory of popular culture that incorporates a piece by Webern into the category of popular culture surely has something wrong with it. But why can't a piece of Webern's tonal music become a piece of popular culture for Fiske if it is used by the people for purposes of resistance? Suppose a rap group plays a recorded selection from Webern at a concert for the purpose of deriding Eurocentric culture. That is, the rap group uses Webern much in the way that the Aborigines used the dying white settlers in movies of the Western genre. Thus, a piece by Webern, say his Fun States for String Quartet Opus 5, 1909, enters the corpus of popular culture. But suddenly any theory of popular culture that, for any reason, counts this piece as an example of popular art or culture is way off the mark. Moreover, if Fiske's definition of popular culture is false, and if his rejection of the existence of mass art depends solely on this easily contested definition, then Fiske's definition poses no threat to my theory of mass art. Of course, we should have anticipated that Fiske's definition of popular culture would bear little resemblance to the ordinary concept of popular culture. For our ordinary concept of popular culture is geared to thinking of popular culture as a collection of products, whereas for Fiske, popular culture is comprised of uses of processes, these processes of resistance. Thus, if we assess Fiske's theory as a reconstruction of our ordinary concept of popular culture, it is bound to fail. But perhaps it will be argued that one misconstrues Fiske's theory as a reconstruction of our ordinary concept of popular culture. Perhaps it is a revisionist stipulative definition, one which, like certain scientific stipulations, should be assessed not in terms of its capacity to track our ordinary concepts of things like gold, but in terms of the way in which it abets empirical discoveries about the nature of things rather than our concepts of things. Fiske's theory may be at variance with received notions of popular culture, but we should accept his radical revision of these notions because of the discoveries, notably the empirical discoveries, that his revision makes possible. Yet, even if we ought to regard Fiske's definition as a stipulative definition of this sort, I think we still have good empirical reasons to reject it. For the research program that Fiske's stipulative definition suggests unavoidably distorts the nature of popular culture, rather than revealing it in a new light. Fiske's theory is not empirically enabling. Rather, it obscures an empirical understanding of popular culture. Put succinctly, the problem with Fiske's theory is that it is overly and unrealistically obsessed with difference. Fiske's theory identifies popular culture with responses to the commodities of the culture industry that are at variance with the intended or anticipated or designed responses to things like movies and TV shows, to popular songs and advertisements. It skews empirical research in the direction of always seeking out the differential, putatively resistant responses of the people to the products of what, if we are not Fiskians, we would call popular culture. For under Fiske's dispensation, it is just the differential responses that comprise popular culture. But this is clearly misguided. People may have differential responses to the commodities of the culture industry, but at the same time, they often have convergent responses. For example, many of the responses of Fiski's urban aborigines must coincide perfectly with the responses that the makers of the westerns in question intentionally designed their movies to elicit. For example, the Aborigines recognized certain of the characters in the films under discussion as white settlers rather than as tree stumps or dung beetles or rocks or planets or even Indians. The Aborigines could not have mobilized their differential adversarial response if they did not already antecedently embrace the intended meaning of the sequences in question, namely that these sequences represented white settlers being massacred. A theory of differential responses of the sort Fiske endorses then makes no sense if one denies that there is a substratum of convergent meanings and recognitions thereof on the part of even resistant audiences. Insofar as Fiske's theory seems to countenance only differential responses, summarily precluding from the purview of theory the relevance of convergent responses to what we pre-theoretically call popular culture, Fiske's theory is bound to distort the phenomenon rather than to illuminate it empirically. Fiske's definition of popular culture neither adequately reconstructs our ordinary concept of popular culture, not is it an empirically fruitful, stipulative redefinition of popular culture. Insofar as Fiske's rejection of the existence of mass culture and, by extension, mass art depends upon his definition of popular culture, my commitment to the notion of mass art is not threatened by Fiske, for there seems to be nothing backing Fiske's definition other than his wish that popular culture be an altogether good object, as a Kleinian psychoanalyst might put it. Furthermore, if I was correct in maintaining that any empirically satisfactory account of popular culture needs to attend to convergent responses in audiences, indeed it needs to explain convergent responses in general, before differential responses are explored, then my hypotheses about mass art have much to recommend them. For I start by thinking of popular art, construed as mass art, in terms of its capacities to elicit convergent responses and understandings amongst vast audiences. This, of course, is not the whole story. There are undoubtedly some examples of resistance to and recodings of mass art of the sort that intrigues John Fiske, and these are certainly worthy of investigation. My point is simply that it does not seem plausible to believe there is as much resistance and recoding as Fiske insinuates. And there is, more importantly, a great deal of convergent response of a sort that Fiske ignores. My theory of mass art, of course, tracks this convergence with a vengeance. Again, this is not the whole story, but may be a good beginning. Notes. Mm-hmm. This counterexample may require more finesse than Novitz provides, since it is not clear that the religious art of the Middle Ages that we are supposed to have in mind here is of the sort that Novitz himself would want to count as high art. For it seems that there were grounds for drawing a distinction between exoteric and esoteric art in the Middle Ages, and furthermore, it is not clear that Novitz is referring to the esoteric variety in the preceding argument. See Peterberg, Popular Culture in Early Modern Europe. Novitz suggests that his assaults upon the putative distinctions between high art and popular art are responses to Abraham Kaplan's The Aesthetics of Popular Art in the second edition of Modern Culture and the Arts. However, Novitz's objections do not really constitute a systematic refutation of all the distinctions alluded to in Kaplan's article. See Abraham Kaplan, The Aesthetics of Popular Art in Modern Culture. For an account of the mendacious market mentality of the contemporary art scene, see Arthur C. Dento, bad aesthetic times in his encounters and reflections out in the historical present. One way to attempt to reframe the distinction that Novitz wants is in such a way that it deflects my George Bush counterexample might be to say that the elite, as a result of their class status, are able to appreciate both high art and popular art, whereas the non-elite only have access to popular art. But this seems false. Membership in the real social elite need not correlate with an appreciation of high art. Does Jesse Helms secretly admire surrealism? While most of the connoisseurs of contemporary high art are certainly marginal. Of course, the latter may think of themselves as elite, but that would be a matter of equivocating on the relevant meaning of the term. Indeed, one fears that it would be difficult to see how Novitz, should he wish to continue to uphold the shaky distinction between elite social classes and other social classes, can do so without begging the question. That is, he can't simply maintain that the elite are at least always the consumers of high art at the same time that he claims to be drawing an informative social distinction about the world as we know it. Since Bourdieu presupposes a more complex stratification of society than Novitz does, he may not be susceptible to the kind of argument advanced above. Nevertheless, I believe that Bourdieu's position will confront other problems which I cannot now explore due to space considerations. Akuvit. I am not suggesting that all contemporary art produced by mass technologies can be sorted into the categories of mass art versus the avant-garde. There are other categories in this area, such as what is sometimes called middlebrow art. Thus, the distinction between mass art and avant-garde art is not comprehensive, though it is crucial. The characterization of further art formulations, such as middlebrow art, are, at this juncture, projects for future research. Thomas J. Roberts writes, "There are traditions that we learn in school and others we learn informally, by word of mouth, by example. Currently, I think that access to the avant-garde tradition is primarily of the form of variety." See Thomas J. Roberts, An Anesthetics of Junk Fiction. It may seem that this advantage is altogether compromised when we turn from the realm of silent films to sound films and TV, insofar as sound brings with it the use of natural languages that require background learning. However, there is some evidence that indicates that the popularity of films still varies inversely with the amount of language in it, e.g., more language often translates into less popularity. See Terry Lotluku talking too much. It should be noted that there are other devices for training the audience of mass art. For example, there are publicity campaigns which encourage preview articles and interviews in newspapers and magazines, and there are TV and radio interviews as well through which the producers of albums, movies, TV programs, and so on prepare audiences for the latest productions. Important. Here a question may arise about how we are to determine what counts as a difference reception site. Obviously, we cannot do it in terms of setting forth a mandatory distance between said reception sites. Two theaters in a multiplex cinema represent two different reception sites, even though they may be in greater proximity than two observation points with respect to Mr. Rushmore. Nevertheless, MT Rushmore as a whole comprises one reception site, whereas the two multiplex theaters are each separate reception sites. In discriminating reception sites, it seems to me we will have to rely, perhaps on a case-by-case basis, primarily on the criteria already operating in ordinary language. My reason for not wishing to count MT Rushmore as an example of mass art, though undoubtedly it was constructed with the intention to accommodate large audiences, is that it is not the product of a mass delivery system. If one were to admit MT Rushmore as mass art, then cathedrals, palaces, and tourist attractions would be mass art, but it seems wrong to me to think of the Eiffel Tower as mass art. MT Rushmore, conceived as mass art, seems to me to be a slippery, indeed treacherous slope. One possible counterexample to my conservatism in these matters might be Disneyland. My initial response to a case like this is to reject it on the same basis that I rejected MT Rushmore. If Disneyland is mass art, then won't St. Peter's and Notre Dame de Paris be mass art as well? However, some may feel that there is a worthwhile difference to be noticed here, for there may be a sense that there is more than one Disneyland, whereas there is not more than one St. Peter's. Disneylands can crop up in more than one place, not only in California, but in Orlando, Florida, and as rumor has it, possibly even outside Paris. Moreover, these Disneylands or Disney Worlds may be cut from the same mold, just as McDonald's hamburger arcs, a species of mass architecture, are cut from the same mold. And with the proliferation of Disneylands, it may be possible for different audiences to experience the same Disney World rides in different sites at the same time. Nevertheless, despite the pressure that I acknowledge that such considerations pose, I am still wary of admitting Disneyland into the realm of mass art. Wouldn't any fairground apparatus constructed in accordance with a preset design, say a wooden, carpentered water slide, then count as mass art? But that seems wrong, since mass technology need not be essential to the production of such rides. Some commentators have worried that, given a performance of a play before an audience which is simultaneously broadcast around the nation, we will have to say that we have two artworks, the play enacted before the audience and the broadcasted play, such that one is a mass artwork and the other is not. On the one hand, we can dissolve the apparent incongruity in a great many cases like this by drawing a distinction between one artwork and a mere recording thereof. On the other hand, if what is broadcast involved editing and changes in camera position such that we do not feel that the broadcasted play should be delegated to the status of a mere recording, then I see no problem with admitting that there are two artworks here, the live play and the broadcast play, only one of which is mass art. For editing and changes in camera position and framing do constitute a layer of artistic interpretation and creativity not available in the enacted performance. One objection to the emphasis that I place on accessibility in the definition of mass art is that certain forms of mass art may in fact be inaccessible to large groups of people. My students, for example, tell me that heavy metal music is inaccessible to their parents. Indeed, it may even be part of the attraction of heavy metal that it be somehow inaccessible to the older set. However, I wonder if heavy metal music is really inaccessible rather than simply distasteful to my students' parents. Wouldn't be the same thing. They could certainly comprehend it without putting very much mental energy into it, even if they didn't like it. In fact, many of these parents may really comprehend it, and that may be the reason they dislike it. But in any case, the question of whether the Lawrence Welk generation or the folk song generation can literally understand Guns N' Roses is different than the question of whether they enjoy them. Even if oldsters tend to couch their dislike misleadingly in phrases like "I just can't understand X," they actually mean "I can't stand X." C'est important. Intéressant, page 33. My emphasis on accessibility may also seem to be at odds with the fact that certain mass art is often targeted at specialized audiences. For example, on cable TV, there is now at least one comedy channel, and there have been rumors that a science fiction channel is also in the offing. In my view, mass art aims at securing the largest audience possible. But how can we square this with the fact that some mass art is customized for limited audiences? Audiences, for example, with a taste for science fiction on the one hand or comedy on the other. However, granting that mass art may be molded to serve special audience interests should not obscure the equally important fact that in terms of basic stylistic choices, of modes of representation and narrative structures, there is no that great difference between what would be shown on a comedy channel and what would be shown on a science fiction channel. The Cosby Show is not really that different from Star Trek of either generation in terms of features like these. Both tell different stories, but their narrative and visual structures are not so different. So even if certain mass art products are, in virtue of their content, tailored to spectators with special interests, nevertheless such works would still gravitate towards securing the largest possible audience in terms of their fundamental stylistic choices. Mm. Though I am primarily concerned with mass art of a modern vintage, most notably mass art in the industrial age, I am also willing to admit that there may be examples, such as popular Japanese woodcuts, that meet my criteria of mass art, but which predate industrialization. Today it may be the case that we especially value such woodcuts because they are rare, that we display them in our museums of fine art, and that we treat them as if they were high art. But all this seems to me compatible with the fact that they are early, perhaps in some senses even technologically primitive, examples of mass art. That we treat such specimens as high art due to their scarcity and/or to their beauty does not preclude their status as early mass art. Maybe some of our contemporary fashion photography will be treated with the same esteem in the 24th century. And in any case, where I invoke the notion of high art in the technical sense of contemporary high art, I mean it to be understood in terms of the avant-garde. So even if we honorifically treat some popular pre-industrial Japanese woodcuts as high art today, we certainly do not mean to imply that they are avant-garde art. The requirement that the mass artwork be art may play a role in dealing with certain types of counterexamples. For example, the contention that things like Roman tiles and manufactured textiles should not count as mass art may be grounded in a view that they are not art. Of course, in order to defend such exclusions, one will ultimately have to produce and defend a view or a theory concerning the ways in which one goes about identifying art. The founding text of this approach is Louis Althusser's Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses in his Lenin and Philosophy and other essays. Interestingly, Fiske is ensaid with the notorious product-process ambiguity, which beset earlier philosophers of art in a new context and in a new way. This problem may have bearing on the work of other proponents of culture studies beyond Fiske as well. Versions of this article were read to the Communications Department of the University of Wisconsin at Madison and to the Society of the Philosophic Study of the Contemporary Visual Arts at the 1991 Eastern Division meetings of the American Philosophical Association. The author has profited immensely from audience comments on both occasions.